The Galactic Council chamber had never been so crowded in its 300-year history, with representatives from every known species packed into the observation galleries to witness the proceedings that would reshape interstellar politics for generations. Taka Ambassador Yan Suji stood at the central podium where Council of Verath had stood weeks earlier to accuse humanity of genocide. But now, the atmosphere in the chamber was vastly different. The evidence recovered from the purifier had been examined by independent investigators from 17 different species, and every single one of them had reached the same conclusion. The Corvith Ascendancy is hereby found guilty of crimes against sentient life, the council moderator announced, their voice echoing through the vast chamber. Their government orchestrated attacks against Velith colonies using stolen human weapon technology, with the intention of destroying both humanity and the Velith sovereignty, while positioning themselves as the dominant power in the region. The Corvith delegation sat in silence as the judgment was read, their usual arrogance replaced by the hollow expression of those who had gambled everything and lost. The following sanctions will be imposed immediately, the moderator continued. Complete disarmament of all Corvith military assets. Reparations to be paid to the Velith sovereignty and the families of the dead. And imprisonment of all government officials found to have participated in the conspiracy. Yan Suji listened to the sanctions and felt a grim satisfaction that was tempered by the knowledge of how close everything had come to disaster. 18 million Velith had died on the colony worlds before the Corvith plan was exposed, and those deaths would forever be a stain on the galaxy's conscience. The Council also wishes to address the matter of the weapon technology used in these attacks, the moderator said, turning to look directly at Yan Suji, Ambassador. The designs recovered from the purifier originated from your species during the Extinction War, and the Council believes it is appropriate to discuss their disposal. Yan Suji stepped forward and activated the holographic display behind her, showing the technical specifications that had haunted humanity for 2 centuries. The Terran Republic has already destroyed every copy of these designs in our possession, she announced, and we formally request that the Council supervise the destruction of the copies recovered from the Corvith as well. Murmurs of surprise rippled through the chamber, because most species would have insisted on keeping such powerful weapons as a deterrent against future threats. We created these weapons in a moment of desperation, Yan Suji explained, and we have regretted their existence ever since, not because they saved us, but because they forced us to become something we never wanted to be. She paused and looked around the chamber at the hundreds of faces watching her, alien and familiar and everything in between. Humanity does not want to be remembered as the species that left planets barren, she continued. We want to be remembered as the species that chose to bury its most terrible weapons and never use them again. The vote to destroy the recovered designs was unanimous, and as the data files were deleted under Council supervision, Yan Suji felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had not realized she was carrying after the formal proceedings concluded. She found herself approached by a delegation she had not expected. The Velith sovereignty had sent their highest officials to Earth, not to offer thanks or demand explanations, but to ask questions. We want to understand, Council of Verath said as they sat together in the Terran embassy, his silver skin no longer pale with grief, but thoughtful with curiosity. You created weapons capable of ending worlds, and then you buried them. And when you learned that someone was using those weapons to kill our people, you risked everything to save us. Yes, Yan Suji agreed simply. Why? Verath asked, and the question carried the weight of 12 billion lives that had almost been lost. Yan Suji considered her answer carefully, because this was perhaps the most important thing she would ever say to an alien species. Because we know what we are capable of, she finally replied. Humans do not pretend that we are good. Counselor. And we do not claim that our history is free of atrocities. But we carry the memory of our worst moments as a warning and a compass. She met his eyes and saw the same grief and determination that she felt reflected in his alien gaze. We left planets barren. She continued. We cannot undo that, and we cannot bring back the dead. But we can make certain that no one else ever suffers the same fate. Even if that means protecting people who hate and fear us. Vareth was silent for a long moment. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a new note of respect. Perhaps we misjudged your species, he admitted. We saw only the weapons and the destruction. But we failed to see the shame that followed. Most species do, Ian Suji said without bitterness. And perhaps that is as it should be, because our shame is our burden to carry. Not yours. Thousands of light years away. Commander Baek Jinho stood before his grandmother's grave in the veteran cemetery outside. New soul, and added a new page to her old journal. He had brought the book with him because it seemed appropriate. This record of guilt and grief that had shaped his understanding of duty and honor. On the new page, he wrote names. But not the names of the dead. Instead, he wrote the names of the living. The 12 billion Velith who would grow old and raise families and live out their lives in peace because human ships had arrived in time to save them. I understand now, he said quietly to the grandmother who could no longer hear him. You taught me that carrying shame is not weakness and feeling guilt is not failure, because it is that weight that keeps us honest about what we are. He closed the journal and looked up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The battleship that left planets barren became the shield that kept the world green. He continued, I think that is something worth remembering. The galaxy still feared humanity, and perhaps it always would. But now that fear was tempered by understanding, humans were dangerous not because they lacked conscience, but because they possessed it so deeply that they would sacrifice anything to prevent others from suffering as their enemies had suffered centuries ago. They had proven that the same species capable of terrible destruction was also capable of profound redemption. And in doing so, they had earned something more valuable than forgiveness. They had earned trust, and in a galaxy filled with species who feared the dark, having a guardian who understood that darkness intimately was perhaps the greatest gift humanity could offer. The stars burned on in their eternal silence, and somewhere among them human ships continued their patrols, watching for threats and protecting the innocent. The human battleship had left planets as barren wastelands, but its legacy had been transformed into something new. Now those same ships stood as sentinels against the darkness, proof that even the deepest sins could be redeemed through courage and sacrifice, and the simple, stubborn refusal to let evil triumph. That was humanity's gift to the galaxy, purchased with blood and guilt and 2 centuries of determined effort to become worthy of the stars they had claimed, and it was a gift that would endure long after the last witness to the Extinction War had passed into memory. The Corvus weapon emerged from subspace like a nightmare-given form, a massive vessel bristling with arrays and emitters that glowed with barely contained energy. Commander Baek Jinho watched through his bridge display as the ship-designated purifier took position above Velith Prime and began its terrible work. The weapon is charging, his tactical officer reported, her voice tight with tension. Velith defense forces are engaging, but their weapons are having minimal effect on the target's shields below them. 12 billion Velith looked up at the sky and saw death descending, and their screams of terror echoed across every communication frequency as evacuation orders that could never be fulfilled were broadcast across the planet. All ships, hold position, Jinho ordered through the fleet channel. We cannot engage until the charging sequence reaches final phase, or we will not penetrate their defenses. It was the hardest order he had ever given. waiting while innocent people died and enemy weapons grew stronger. But he knew that premature action would doom not only the Velith, but humanity as well. Commander, the Velith flagship is broadcasting a surrender offer to the Corvith vessel, his communications officer reported. They are begging for mercy. The Corvith are not responding, another officer added. The weapon continues charging without pause. Jinho gripped the arms of his command chair and forced himself to watch as Velith ships threw themselves at the Vi, Purifier in desperate attacks that accomplished nothing except adding to the death toll his grandmother had watched. Similar scenes during the Extinction War had given similar orders that sent brave crews to die against impossible odds. And he finally understood why she had never spoken of those days. Charging sequence entering final phase. The tactical officer announced. Shield fluctuation beginning in 30 seconds. All ships prepare to engage, Jinho commanded. And he felt the tension on the bridge ratchet up to almost unbearable levels. Target the primary emitter array the moment their shields drop. 20 seconds. The Purifier's weapons arrays began to glow brighter as energy built toward the critical threshold. And across Velith Prime, billions of people huddled with their families and waited for the end. 10 seconds. Jinho thought of his grandmother and the journals filled with names of the dead. And he made a silent promise that today he would add names to a different list. Shields dropping. The tactical officer shouted. Vulnerability window is open. All ships, attack. Jinho roared. The Terran fleet surged forward as one. 37 vessels of various sizes pouring fire into the exposed flank of the Corvith. Weapon ship. The Purifier's crew had not expected resistance, and their response was slow and confused, allowing the human ships to close to optimal firing range before defensive systems could be brought online. Focus fire on the primary emitter, Jinho ordered as his flagship, the TSS Reckoning, led the charge. We need to disable the weapon before they can complete the charging sequence. Explosions blossomed across the Purifier's hull as human weapons found their marks. But the massive vessel was built to withstand punishment, and it continued its deadly countdown despite the damage it was taking, charging at 80% and climbing. The tactical officer reported. We are not doing enough damage to stop it. Jinho made a decision in that moment that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A choice that his grandmother would have understood all too well. How? Plot a collision course with the primary emitter array, he ordered, his voice steady despite the death sentence he was pronouncing. All hands, prepare for emergency evacuation. Commander, you cannot be serious, his first officer protested. I am completely serious, Jinho replied. If we cannot destroy that weapon with our guns, we will destroy it with our ship. And I will not ask anyone to die with me who does not choose to stay. No one moved toward the escape pods. We stay with you, Commander, his tactical officer said. And the determination in her voice was echoed by every face on the bridge. The TSS Reckoning accelerated toward the Purifier as the countdown continued. But before they could complete their suicide run, something unexpected happened. The concentrated fire from the rest of the Terran fleet finally breached the Purifier's armor and struck the energy containment systems that regulated the weapon's power. The explosion that followed was visible from the surface of Velith Prime. A brilliant flash of light that turned night into day for a brief moment before fading into the darkness of space. The Purifier is disabled, the tactical officer reported, her voice shaking with relief. Weapon systems are offline, and the ship is venting atmosphere from multiple breaches. Corvith crew members are abandoning ship, another officer added. They are broadcasting distress signals on all frequencies. Jinho slumped back in his chair and felt tears running down his cheeks. Tears of relief and exhaustion and something else he could not quite name. Begin rescue operations for all survivors, human and Corvith alike. he ordered. And secure the Purifier's data cores before anyone can destroy the evidence. As Terran ships moved to carry out his commands, Jinho opened a channel to the Velith flagship that was still floating in shocked silence nearby. "This is Commander Beak Jinho of the Terran Republic," he said. "We apologize for entering your space without permission. But we hope you will understand that the circumstances were urgent. The response took several seconds to arrive. And when it did, the Velith commander's voice was thick with emotions that transcended species barriers. You saved us," the alien officer said simply. "You saved all of us. That was the intention," Jinho replied. And despite everything that had happened, he found himself smiling. "Now, if you will excuse me, I need to help your people recover from this attack and make sure the galaxy learns the truth about who was really responsible." The evidence recovered from the Purifier was broadcast across every council channel within the hour. Undeniable proof of Corvith involvement in the attacks that had killed millions and nearly destroyed billions more humanity had been vindicated. But as Jinho floated in a damaged escape pod watching human rescue ships descend through Velith Prime's atmosphere to help both species, he knew that the true victory was something more personal. Today he had earned the right to visit his grandmother's grave and tell her that her shame had finally been transformed into something worth remembering. "Ambassador Yeon." Suji stared at the intelligence briefing spread across her desk and felt the weight of 12 billion lives pressing down on her shoulders. The evidence Commander Beak had gathered was compelling but not conclusive. Enough to convince humans, but not enough to persuade a hostile council that had already decided on humanity's guilt. "We cannot accuse the Corvith publicly without proof that will stand up to council scrutiny," she said to the assembled leaders of Terran Command who had gathered in the secure briefing room. "If we make accusations we cannot support with hard evidence, we will look like desperate criminals trying to shift blame onto an innocent party. But if we stay silent, Velith Prime dies, and we take the blame anyway," Admiral Cho Yuna replied, her weathered face tight with frustration. "There has to be something we can do." Yeon Suji had spent 3 sleepless nights considering every option and every outcome, and she had finally settled on a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal, depending on how the next few days unfolded. "There is a third path," she announced, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. "We cannot prove the Corvith are responsible without catching them in the act, which means we need to let them attack Velith Prime and stop them before they complete their mission." The silence that followed her words was thick with disbelief and horror. "You want us to gamble 12 billion lives on our ability to intercept a weapon we have never seen in action?" Admiral Cho demanded. "I want us to do the only thing that will prove our innocence and expose the real criminals," Yeon Suji corrected. "The Corvith weapon will have to decloak and charge before it can fire. And during that charging sequence, it will be vulnerable to attack." "How can you be certain of that?" another admiral asked. "Because my grandmother helped design the original Prometheus systems." Commander Beak spoke up from his position near the door. "I have studied her technical notes extensively, and every weapon based on those designs requires a 15-second vulnerability window during final charge sequence when the shields must be lowered to allow energy buildup. The Corvith may have eliminated that weakness in their improved version," Admiral Cho pointed out. "They may have reduced it, but they cannot have eliminated it entirely," Beak replied with quiet confidence. "The physics of atmospheric stripping require a massive energy discharge that no known shielding technology can contain. And that means there will always be a window when the weapon is exposed." Yeon Suji watched the military leaders exchange glances and saw the calculation in their eyes as they weighed the risks against the alternatives. "Even if your plan succeeds, we will be violating Velith space with a military fleet," Admiral Cho said slowly. "That alone could be considered an act of war. which is why I'm going to tell them we are coming, Yan Suji replied. And the shock on the faces around her was almost worth the 3 nights of lost sleep. Not the Velith government, because they would refuse our help and alert the Corvith. But I know 3 council members who might be willing to listen. What followed was the most dangerous diplomatic gambit of Yan Suji's career. She contacted 3 ambassadors she had worked with over the years. Species representatives who had shown fairness and wisdom in their dealings with humanity. And she told them everything. 2 of them dismissed her claims as desperate fabrication and cut communications without another word. The 3rd was Elder Morvith of the Silacine Collective, a being of living crystal who had served on the council for over 300 years and whose perfect memory stretched back to events that most species had forgotten. I remember the Extinction War, Morvith said through the secure channel, their crystalline form pulsing with soft light as they spoke. I remember the human fleet that destroyed 3 worlds and ended the greatest threat the galaxy had ever faced. Then you understand why we are being blamed for these attacks. Yan Suji said carefully, I understand why the accusation seems plausible, Morvith corrected. But I also remember something that the rest of the galaxy has chosen to forget. The ancient being paused. And when they continued, their voice carried the weight of centuries. When the war ended and the human victory was complete, your species did not celebrate, Morvith said. Your leaders wept before the council and begged forgiveness for what they had done. And then they dismantled their fleet and built monuments to their enemies' dead. We carry the weight of those deaths even now, Yan Suji admitted, her voice thick with emotion she could not quite control. That is precisely why I believe you, Morvith replied. A species capable of such guilt would not repeat their sins without cause. And I see no cause here that would justify what has been done to the Velith colonies. With Morvith's support, Yan Suji was able to establish a secret communication channel that would allow the Terran fleet to enter Velith space without triggering an immediate military response. It was not permission, and it was not approval. But it was a chance. The fleet is ready to depart, Admiral Cho reported as the final preparations were completed. Commander Beak has volunteered to lead the intercept force personally. Does he understand that if we fail, he will be remembered as the man who proved humanity's guilt? Yan Suji asked. He understands, the Admiral replied. He said something about his grandmother and earning the right to look at her grave without shame. Yan Suji nodded and felt a sudden kinship with the young commander she had never met. 2 people carrying the weight of old sins and trying desperately to prevent new ones. Tell him that 12 billion Velith are counting on him, she said, even though they do not know it yet, as the Terran fleet jumped toward Velith Prime. Yan Suji stood alone in her office and prayed to whatever powers might be listening. Humanity had created weapons capable of ending worlds, and now they were racing to stop those weapons from being used against people who hated and feared them. It was either the greatest act of redemption in human history or the beginning of the end for their entire species. Only time would tell which one it would be. Commander Beak Jinho stood on the bridge of the TSS Vigilance and stared at what remained of Velith Minor through the observation windows. His jaw tight with emotions, he could not afford to show his crew. The planet below looked like a corpse left too long in the sun, gray and cracked and utterly devoid of the life that had once covered its surface in shades of green and blue. Atmospheric analysis complete, his science officer reported, in a voice that was carefully neutral despite the horror of what she was describing. The planet has been stripped of all breathable gases down to the molecular level, and the surface temperature has risen to levels incompatible with any known form of organic life. Survivors? Jinho asked. Though he already knew the answer, none detected, Commander. And based on our scans, there is no possibility that any survived the initial attack, Jinho nodded and turned away from the window because looking at the dead world was making it difficult to think clearly. And he needed every bit of clarity he could muster. His team had been sent to investigate the Velith graveyard worlds in secret, tasked with finding evidence that would prove humanity's innocence before the Council's deadline expired. What they had found instead was something far more troubling than simple proof of guilt or innocence. The destruction method is definitely based on human designs. His chief analyst Han Mireille explained as she projected her findings onto the main display. The atmospheric stripping field uses the same fundamental principles as the original Prometheus weapon systems. But Jinho prompted because he had heard the hesitation in her voice. But the execution shows refinements that humanity never developed. Mireille continued, highlighting several data points on her display. Our version of this technology was crude and inefficient compared to what was used here. And whoever built this weapon had access to materials and techniques that were beyond our capabilities during the Extinction War. Jinho studied the data and felt a cold certainty forming in his mind. A theory that would explain everything but would also create problems far worse than simple accusations. Can you identify where these refinements might have originated? He asked. I already have, Mireille replied. And her expression was grim as she brought up a new set of data. The trace elements left behind in the destruction pattern include materials that are only found in Corvus space. Specifically a rare isotope that the Corvus Ascendancy uses in their advanced manufacturing processes. The bridge fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications of what she had just said. The Corvus were respected members of the Galactic Council, a species known for their technological prowess and their diplomatic neutrality. And they had been among the loudest voices calling for punishment of humanity in the aftermath of the attacks. Are you telling me that the Corvus stole our weapon designs and improved them? Jinho asked, needing to hear the words spoken aloud. I am telling you that someone with access to Corvus technology built this weapon using human blueprints as a foundation. Mireille corrected carefully. Whether that was the Corvus government or some rogue faction within their territory is something I cannot determine from this evidence alone. Jinho walked to his command chair and sat down heavily, his mind racing through the strategic implications of what they had discovered. If the Corvus had engineered these attacks to frame humanity, then they had planned this operation for years or possibly decades. And their goal was almost certainly to start a war that would destroy both humanity and the Velith, while leaving the Corvus as the dominant power in the region. It was a brilliant and horrifying plan, and exposing it without hard proof would only make humanity look more guilty. Commander, his communications officer interrupted. We are intercepting an encrypted transmission on Corvus military frequencies. And based on the signal strength, it is originating from somewhere nearby. Can you decode it? Jinho asked. Already working on it, sir? And I should have results within the hour. Jinho nodded and tried to focus on the tactical situation. But his thoughts kept drifting to his grandmother and the journal she had left behind when she died. She had served aboard the original HS Prometheus during the Extinction War, and she had never spoken about what happened during those terrible years. But after her funeral, Jinho had found her private writings and learned the truth, page after page filled with names of the dead, written in her careful handwriting over and over again, like a prayer that could never be answered. And at the end, a simple statement that had haunted him ever since. We did what we had to do to survive, she had written. But I will carry the weight of those deaths until my last breath and beyond. Now someone was using his grandmother's shame as a weapon against her entire species. And Jinho felt a fury building inside him that was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Transmission decoded. Commander, his communications officer announced, breaking through his dark thoughts. You need to hear this. The bridge speakers crackled with static, And then a voice, speaking in the distinctive harmonics of the Korvath language, filled the air. And even without understanding the words, Jinho could hear the arrogance in every syllable. Translation running now. The communications officer reported. The message reads as follows. Primary targets eliminated as planned. And secondary phase will commence in 6 cycles. With final target designated as Velith Prime. Jinho felt his blood turn to ice as the meaning of those words became clear. Velith Prime was the Velith homeworld. A planet of 12 billion souls who had no idea that death was coming for them in less than a week. They are going to destroy Velith Prime and blame us for it, he said aloud. And the horror in his voice was reflected on every face around him. 12 billion people will die, and humanity will be hunted to extinction for a crime we did not commit. What do we do, Commander? Mireille asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Jinho stood and looked around at his crew. These brave men and women who had volunteered for a mission that might be the most important in human history. We warn Terran Command, and we pray that they can figure out how to stop this, he replied. Because if we fail, my grandmother's journals will be the least of the sins that haunt our species. The TSS Vigilance turned toward home and engaged its faster-than-light drive, carrying news that would shake humanity to its core and force decisions that would determine the fate of billions. The emergency transmission arrived at the Galactic Council headquarters during the night cycle, and within hours, every ambassador in the known galaxy had been summoned to the Great Chamber. Councilor Verath of the Velith Sovereignty stood at the central podium, with his forearms trembling and his silver skin pale with grief as he addressed the assembled representatives. 3 of our colony worlds have gone silent, he announced, his voice breaking with emotion that needed no translation across species barriers. We sent scout ships to investigate what we hoped was a communications failure. But what they found was beyond our worst nightmares. The holographic display behind him flickered to life, showing images that made several ambassadors gasp or emit sounds of distress in their native languages. Where the lush green world of Velith Minor had once orbited its golden sun, there was now only a barren gray rock stripped of everything that had made it alive. And the oceans that had covered 60% of its surface had been boiled away into nothing, leaving behind cracked and scorched earth that would never again support life. The same fate befell Velis Secundus and the agricultural world of New Harmony. Verath continued, his grief hardening into something colder and more dangerous. 80 million of our people lived on these worlds, and now there is nothing left of them but dust and silence. Ambassador Yan Suji of the Terran Republic sat in the human delegation section with her hands folded carefully in her lap. But her heart was racing as she watched the horrible images cycle through the display. She had studied enough history to recognize what she was seeing, and the cold dread settling in her stomach told her that others would recognize it too. The method of destruction matches only one known weapon system in galactic records, Verath said, and his eyes turned toward the human delegation with an accusation that needed no words. 200 years ago, during what the humans call the Extinction War, their vessel designated HSS Prometheus rendered 3 enemy homeworlds uninhabitable using this exact technique. Murmurs rippled through the chamber as dozens of alien species turned to look at the small human contingent, and Yan Suji felt the weight of their stares like a physical pressure against her chest. The Terran Republic dismantled the Prometheus-class weapons after the war, she said, rising to her feet and keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will. We made a vow before this very council that such weapons would never be used again. And we have honored that vow for 2 centuries. Then how do you explain this? Verath demanded, gesturing at the images of dead worlds behind him. The atmospheric stripping pattern is identical to your historical records, and the radiation signature matches your old weapon specifications exactly. I cannot explain it, Yan Suji admitted, because she had learned long ago that lies would only make things worse. But I can promise you that humanity did not do this, and I am asking for time to prove our innocence." The chamber erupted into chaos as representatives shouted accusations and demands in a dozen different languages. And it took several minutes for the council moderator to restore order. "The Terran Republic will be given 30 standard cycles to investigate this matter," the moderator announced once silence had been achieved. "If satisfactory evidence of their innocence is not provided by that time, the council will convene to discuss appropriate responses." Ian Suji understood what appropriate responses meant in diplomatic language, and the threat of united military action against humanity hung in the air like poison gas. She gathered her delegation and walked out of the chamber with her head held high, ignoring the hostile stares that followed her every step. But the moment she reached the privacy of the Terran embassy, her composure cracked. How is this possible? She asked her aide, a young man named Park Do-hyun, who had served with her for 3 years. The Prometheus designs were destroyed after the war, and the ships themselves were dismantled and their components scattered across a dozen star systems. Someone must have kept copies of the schematics, Do-hyun suggested, his face troubled. The black market for human military technology has always been active, despite our best efforts to suppress it. Ian Suji closed her eyes and thought about the history that every human child learned in school. The story of how humanity had nearly destroyed itself and then turned that capacity for destruction outward against an alien threat that had sought to exterminate them. The Extinction War had lasted 12 terrible years, and by the end, humanity had been so desperate that they had created weapons capable of sterilizing entire planets. And they had used those weapons 3 times before their enemies finally surrendered. Victory had tasted like ashes in every human mouth. And the generation that had fought that war had spent the rest of their lives trying to atone for what they had done. Now, someone was using human weapons to kill innocent people and blame humanity for the crime. And Ian Suji knew that if she could not find the truth, everything her species had worked to build in 2 centuries of peace would be destroyed. Her secure communicator buzzed with an incoming message marked with the highest classification level. And when she read the words on the screen, her blood ran cold. "We found something." The message from Terran Command read, "It is worse than we thought, and we need you to return to Earth immediately for a classified briefing." Ian Suji looked at Do-hyun and saw her own fear reflected in his eyes, because they both understood that humanity was standing at the edge of a precipice. If they fell, billions would die in the war that followed, and the galaxy would remember humans only as the monsters who had created weapons of planetary destruction. "Prepare my ship," she ordered, straightening her spine and pushing her fear down into the depths where it could not paralyze her. "We have 30 cycles to save our species from a crime we did not commit." As she walked toward the embassy hangar, Ian Suji thought about the old saying that the sins of the past always found their way back to haunt the present. Humanity had buried its darkest weapons and sworn never to use them again. But someone had dug them up and turned them into instruments of genocide. Finding out who and stopping them would require every resource humanity possessed. And even then it might not be enough, but humans had faced extinction before and survived through sheer stubborn refusal to surrender. And Ian Suji was determined that her people would survive this crisis as well. The stars outside her window seemed colder than usual as her ship lifted off and set course for Earth. And somewhere in the vast darkness between those stars, a weapon of human design was preparing to kill again.